Mel Gibson, the unyielding giant of Hollywood, the storm that shook cinema to its core. From the desolate roads of Mad Max to the immortal cry of Braveheart, he gave the world heroes that time cannot erase. From an anonymous laborer in the noise of factories, he rose to become a legend of cinema and to amass a fortune of more than $500 million. With his own island, sprawling estates, and the admiration of a generation in his hands. More than just an actor or a director, he became a monument of faith and fire. A man who turned hardship into strength and carved his name deep into the history of film. For decades, Gibson has stood as one of Hollywood's defining faces, daring, resilient, unforgettable. And yet even legends carry wounds that no fame can conceal. A fortress of happiness built over 26 years was crushed in the most expensive divorce in Hollywood history. The scandals that followed dragged his private pain into the ruthless light, reducing a reputation built over decades to ashes. The world saw only the warrior's cry, the blazing fire, the glory of a man larger than life. But behind that radiance was a soul scarred by betrayal, by the darkness of alcohol, by the silence of homes once filled with laughter, now turned to cinders. Let us journey through a life overflowing with triumphs, yet scarred by loss and storms. And if you believe that Mel Gibson is one of the most talented legends in the history of cinema, leave a like, as a gesture of tribute to the man who dared to walk through fire and rise once more. Every storm begins not with thunder, but with silence. A silence so heavy, it crushes the soul. For Mel Gibson, that silence began on January 3rd, 1956, in Peekskill, New York, where he entered the world as the sixth of 11 children. 11 children under one fragile roof. A home where walls cracked under the pressure of too many small bodies, where winter nights brought shivers because coats were too thin, and where dinner plates were stretched so far that each child went to bed with hunger gnawing quietly at their stomachs. His father bent his back to the rails, a man who rose before dawn and staggered home long after sunset. His hands blistered, his muscles burned all for wages that vanished too quickly into the mouths of hungry children. His mother carried her own cross, the endless weight of infants on her hip, toddlers tugging at her dress, sleepless nights broken by the cries of babies who knew only need, while whispered prayers in the dark were her only rest. And just when one child was barely strong enough to stand, another arrived tiny and fragile, adding yet another voice to the chorus of need. She patched worn clothes until the fabric turned to threads, stretched meals until they were little more than broth. And still it was never enough. Years later, Gibson would recall with a half smile, half wound, "We didn't have much. Hand-me-downs, watered-down meals that was normal. It makes you tough, but it also makes you hungry in ways that never leave." The house itself seemed to suffocate. With the press of bodies, the air crowded not only by children, but by the crushing weight of survival, a cage built not of steel, but of poverty and sacrifice. When Mel was 12, the family gathered their meager belongings, clothes, worn thin shoes already frayed, and memories they could not carry, and crossed oceans in search of a better life. But what awaited was no promised land, only another crucible. Australia was vast, alien, and unyielding. 11 children and 2 weary parents squeezed into cramped rooms chasing wages that dissolved before the week was done. The children were strangers in a land that never let them forget it. Their accents ridiculed their clothes, mocked their very presence, treated as a stain. And for Mel, the cruelty was personal. In the classroom, he was the odd boy with the wrong voice. In the schoolyard, he was cornered, shoved and stripped of dignity by laughter that cut deeper than fists. Years later, he would whisper of those days I was shy and I was picked on, so I started to fight back. His fists became his only defense, not the weapon of a rebel, but the trembling cry of a boy begging the world to leave him in peace. But bruises fade. The scars of the heart did not. Nights ended with isolation pressing in like a suffocating fog. Hunger gnawed. Loneliness whispered that he was unwanted, unseen, unloved. And to silence those whispers, he reached for the wrong refuge drink long before a child should ever know its taste. It was not rebellion, not thrill, but surrender. A fragile boy sought shadows for comfort, shadows that would one day grow into storms that haunted his life for decades. At home, the burden was crushing. 11 children stretched every coin into dust. His father broke his back for wages on the rails, his mother's hands raw from endless chores, yet the table still held more need than bread. Meals were counted, not savored. Every bite measured against tomorrow's hunger. Gibson would later reflect with piercing honesty. You never forget what it feels like to look at the table and wonder if there will be enough. That kind of fear doesn't go away. It follows you. Childhood joys, toys, warmth, freedom were fantasies that belonged to other children, not to the Gibsons. Faith ruled the household with an iron hand. Strict rules disciplined duty without choice. For Mel, a sensitive soul yearning to breathe it was another cage. By his late teens, he sought work wherever it could be found. Factories that reeked of sweat and iron, plants where machines screamed through endless nights. He lifted, carried, bent his body until his mind dulled into numbness. Years later, he confessed, I felt my brain was dying in those factories. That's when I knew I had to find something more. Each shift was not just labor. It was a sentence, a grim reminder that without escape, he might vanish into obscurity. Another forgotten man swallowed by monotony. And yet even in storms, fate whispers. His sister, seeing a flicker of fire buried beneath the wounds, secretly filled out an application to the National Institute of Dramatic Art, Australia's most prestigious drama school, a place where legends were born. She pressed $5 into his hand. The cost of a chance, the price of destiny. He arrived, battered face still bruised from yet another fight, and walked out accepted. In that single moment, the door opened. The boy who had fought shadows with fists and bottles now had a stage, and for the first time, light broke through the storm. Emerging from the suffocating shadows of poverty and isolation, Mel Gibson stumbled into his early 20s, not with certainty, but with exhaustion carved into his bones and doubt gnawing at his mind. He had endured endless nights in factories where machines screamed louder than his thoughts, where the air stank of sweat and iron, and where he often felt his spirit dissolving shift by shift. I felt my brain was dying in those factories, he would later confess. Words that revealed just how close he had come to disappearing into anonymity. The fragile chance his sister had given him, that single $5 lifeline into the National Institute of Dramatic Art, was not a luxury, but a rescue. At NIDA, he trained not like a student of privilege, but like a survivor, clawing for life. Rehearsals stretched long into the night. He fought fatigue, fought fear, fought the voice that told him he did not belong. On stage, he poured himself into Oedipus Henry IV, Romeo and Juliet roles that demanded not only memory and craft, but the surrender of his soul. Each performance was not practice, it was survival. Each curtain call was proof he could still matter. By 1977, he caught his first glimpse of cinema with Summer City. The role was small, the pay, almost nothing, but it required the same exhaustion as his stage work. Long hours, cheap sets, and endless retakes left him staggering home as though he had returned to the factory floor. Yet it was here he learned that the camera could expose more than the body. It could expose the very soul. Then came fate's cruel trick and its miracle. In 1979, Gibson accompanied a friend to an audition for Mad Max. He had not even planned to try out. His face was bruised and swollen from a barroom fight, and the casting team turned him away, telling him to return when the wounds had healed. Weeks later, he walked back in, nearly unrecognizable, and against every odd was handed the lead role. What followed was no glamorous breakthrough, but grueling work. The budget was so tight that cast and crew lived on scraps. Gibson spent hours under the punishing Australian sun, strapped into cars patched together with bolts, and hope performing stunts that left his body aching and his spirit drained. And yet, when Mad Max exploded into a global phenomenon, the boy who once felt invisible was suddenly staring back from movie posters around the world. That same year, he carried the weight of Tim, a role that demanded he inhabit the life of a gentleman with intellectual challenges. To embody fragility with honesty required more than acting. It required a stripping of defenses. The performance won him Best Actor at the Australian Film Institute, but the cost was nights of emotional exhaustion, carrying a loneliness that was not his own. In 1981, Gibson bared even more of himself in Peter Weir's Gallipoli, where he played a soldier chasing youthful dreams only to meet the futility of war. The film demanded he relive despair night after night, embodying the loss of a generation. By 1982, he was tested further in The Year of Living Dangerously and Attack Force Z. The former plunged him into the chaos of political unrest and doomed love. The latter pushed him through the physical demands of war drama, often shot in rough conditions, that left cast and crew battered by weather and exhaustion. By 1984, when he stood alongside Anthony Hopkins in The Bounty Gibson, was no longer the battered kid mocked in a schoolyard or the nameless worker in a factory line. He was a rising star, but one carved by hardship. A man whose early triumphs were paid for in bruises, sweat, sleepless nights, and the constant terror of failure. These years were not a gentle beginning. They were battles of the body and of the soul. And it was through those battles that Gibson transformed pain into art and obscurity into destiny. By 1984, Mel Gibson was standing at the threshold of stardom, but the path ahead was anything but smooth. On the set of The Bounty, his talent blazed with raw energy. But away from the cameras, another story was unfolding. Nights spilled into parties, fists, and alcohol-fueled chaos, until mornings revealed a face swollen with the marks of recklessness. Even those around him could see that behind the brilliance was a fire, burning too hot, threatening to consume everything he had worked for. Among them was Anthony Hopkins, who had once battled the same demons and recognized the danger immediately. Watching Gibson spiral, he issued a warning that cut through the noise. "You're going to destroy your career if you keep this up." For Gibson, it was more than advice. It was a chilling reminder that genius and self-destruction often walk the same path, and that one misstep could turn triumph into ruin. That same year, he delivered what critics would later call one of his most authentic performances in The River. Playing a struggling farmer, fighting to protect his land, Gibson poured into the role the very desperation he had known in childhood, hunger toil, and the feeling that survival itself was always hanging by a thread. Audiences believed him not because he was acting, but because he was reliving. It was a role that demanded exhaustion, long days under the elements, but it reminded the world that Mel Gibson was not merely a handsome face. He was an actor of depth, one who could channel his own scars into art. Then came the role that would brand him into Hollywood's collective memory, Martin Riggs, in Lethal Weapon 1987. Riggs was a reckless cop haunted by grief, a man whose wild stunts barely concealed the fractures of his soul. To embody Riggs, Gibson went beyond scripts. He trained relentlessly in martial arts, endured punishing physical routines, and hurled himself into explosions so real they rattled his bones. On set, laughter often gave way to bruises, burns, and the toll of playing a man who carried too much pain. Offset, the line between character and actor blurred. The franchise exploded into an empire, cementing Gibson as a global superstar, but it also deepened his dependence on the adrenaline of chaos. Fame fed his image, but it also fed the darker shadows, drinking binges, brawls, and the quiet erosion of his health. And then, against all odds, came the triumph that almost no one in Hollywood believed he could achieve. In 1995, Mel Gibson gambled everything on Braveheart, not just playing the defiant William Wallace, but commanding the battlefield from the director's chair. The production was a war in itself. Endless hours waist-deep in mud, freezing winds lashing across the Scottish Highlands, and the impossible task of directing thousands of extras while still wearing the heavy steel of Wallace's armor. His voice grew hoarse from shouting commands. His body ached under the weight of stunts performed again and again, yet he refused to surrender to fatigue. He would not sleep, colleagues recalled, until every frame burned with truth. The cost was visible. His face bore the hollow lines of exhaustion, his temper sharpened by pressure, his body driven to the edge of collapse. But Gibson pressed on with the ferocity of a man who knew he was no longer just fighting for a film. He was fighting for his place in history. And when the dust finally settled, the impossible became real. Braveheart thundered across the world, sweeping 5 Academy Awards, including Best Director and Best Picture. On that night, Gibson walked to the stage with statues in his hands and fire in his eyes. No longer the shy, hungry boy mocked in a schoolyard, but a titan of cinema. The magnitude of his ascent was staggering. From a childhood where meals were stretched thin and every coin turned to dust, Gibson had risen to command paychecks of over $20 million per film by the mid-1990s. The boy who once wore hand-me-down clothes now stood among the highest-paid actors on Earth, his net worth climbing into the hundreds of millions. Braveheart was not only art, it was vindication proof that resilience could carve a kingdom out of nothing. The world now saw him not merely as an actor, but as a force of will, a man who had taken his scars, his hunger, and his storms, and turned them into eternal glory. But the Oscars did not erase the storm. The very decade that lifted him to Olympus also hollowed him out. The weight of success, the lure of excess, the nights lost to alcohol, the bruises hidden under costumes, all of it clung to him like shadows that refused to let go. Behind every standing ovation was a man staggering under the cost of his own brilliance. Once mocked as a boy in hand-me-down clothes, Mel Gibson, in 2004, stood like a conqueror at the very summit of Hollywood storms already gathering on the horizon. With the passion of the Christ, he staked everything: his fortune, his reputation, even his standing in the industry, pouring nearly $30 million of his own money into a vision most thought impossible. The film was gritty and uncompromising, dividing critics and igniting fierce debate across the globe. Yet audiences flooded theaters in waves. Against every doubt, the gamble paid off beyond imagination. Over $600 million at the box office, with another $100 million in DVDs and merchandise. It was not just cinema, it was a cultural earthquake. Gibson, once the hungry child lost in a crowded house, now stood as a titan of conviction, proving that faith and fire could shake the world, but triumph can turn to ashes overnight. In 2006, a single night shattered the illusion of invincibility. Arrested for driving under the influence, Gibson's words cut deeper than any blade, leaving wounds on his legacy that no spotlight could conceal. Alcohol, the shadow he had courted since youth, revealed its cruelest truth. It was not a refuge, but a thief, robbing him of clarity, dignity, and trust. The headlines were merciless, the backlash swift. The man who once carried Hollywood on his shoulders was banished to silence, his name no longer spoken with awe, but with disdain. It was not a stumble, it was exile. For nearly a decade, he wandered in the wilderness of closed doors and vanished projects, bearing the weight of shame, heavier than any armor he had ever worn on screen. And yet Gibson refused to let the bottle or the silence define him. He made a choice not once, but every morning he opened his eyes. He walked into the rooms of recovery, admitted what others would deny, and embraced sobriety not as a miracle, but as a discipline of fire. It's not easy. It's a battle every day, he confessed. Piece by fragile piece, he rebuilt himself. The fire that once nearly consumed him was reforged into iron will. His scars did not disappear, they became his armor. Proof that redemption is not born of perfection, but of perseverance. Then in 2016 came a resurrection so improbable it felt like legend. Gibson stepped into the director's chair with Hacksaw Ridge, the story of Desmond Doss, a man who braved carnage without a weapon and carried 75 wounded soldiers to safety with nothing but faith and bare hands. As Doss dragged bodies from the battlefield, Gibson was dragging his own broken career from the wreckage of exile. The filming itself was war mud thick as chains, staged blasts that rattled the ground walls of flame and smoke, swallowing entire sets. In the middle of it all stood Gibson, commanding armies of extras, orchestrating chaos, shot by shot, driving himself and his cast to exhaustion. But this time, his fire was no longer reckless. It was focused, purified, reborn. When Hacksaw Ridge thundered onto screens, the world felt the shock. 6 Academy Award nominations, 2 wins, and a standing ovation from an industry that once cast him aside. In a single night, Gibson silenced a decade of doubt. From Braveheart's mud-soaked battlefields to the passion's firestorm of faith, from the abyss of scandal to the redemption of Hacksaw Ridge, his life itself had become an epic, a parable carved in fire. He did not just return, he resurrected. Not as the fallen star of yesterday, but as living proof that greatness is not the absence of failure, but the courage to rise when the world believes you cannot. At the height of his fame, when Mel Gibson was draped in Oscars and his face lit up billboards across the globe, his greatest triumph was not on a movie set, but in the sanctuary of marriage. In 1980, he wed Robin Moore, an Australian dental nurse whose quiet grace and steady warmth stood like a beacon against the chaos of Hollywood. For a man who had grown up with too many siblings in too little space where hunger gnawed and comfort was scarce, this union felt like a miracle. Together, they built what the industry rarely allows a home that was not performance, but peace. For 26 years, their world bloomed with the life of 7 children. 7 voices that turned silence into song. 7 sets of footsteps pounding joyfully across the halls. 7 pairs of hands tugging at a father once mocked as a boy, but now crowned as a hero in their eyes. Around the dinner table, the sound of laughter replaced the echoes of Gibson's own childhood hunger. He had once fought through nights with little more than broth, yet now he bowed his head over tables overflowing with warmth. Surrounded by a family that seemed to prove he had finally outrun the shadows of his past, it was not wealth that defined those years, but the ordinariness of joy. School mornings, bedtime stories, the chaos of birthdays with too many candles to count. While Hollywood demanded he be a titan, Robin gave him something infinitely rarer, the chance to be simply a husband, a father, a man. To friends, and to the watching world, their marriage was a fortress, a love story that seemed to defy the curse of broken vows that haunted their industry. For decades, as the cameras flashed and the world screamed his name, Gibson's truest identity was found in a home where no applause was needed, and where the only audience that mattered was the family who loved him, not as a star, but as their own. But even the strongest fortresses crack when storms pound long enough. What once felt unshakable slowly began to wear thin. Long shoots pulled him away from the dinner table. Premieres and press tours swallowed holidays and the shadows he had carried since youth. The old refuge of drink, the restless demons of despair crept into the home he had sworn to protect. Robin tried to hold the walls steady. She once said quietly to friends, "You learn patience. When you're married to someone the world wants more than you." For years, she endured where many would have walked away carrying the weight of silence, of absences of promises that were too often broken. To outsiders, theirs was still the miracle marriage that had defied Hollywood's curse. Behind closed doors, though, love was being tested in ways no applause could heal. The breaking point did not arrive with a single explosion, but as a slow collapse, 1,000 small fractures giving way to ruin. By 2006, when Gibson's private struggles spilled violently into the headlines, the cracks that had been hidden became impossible to ignore. He later admitted, "I hurt the people I loved the most. That's something you never forget." By 2011, after 26 years and 7 children, the divorce was final. It was one of the costliest in Hollywood's history, nearly $400 million changing hands. But no sum could measure the true loss. The collapse of a sanctuary that had once been the only place where Gibson was not a star, but simply a man loved without conditions. For Gibson, it was not a legal procedure. It was an earthquake. The man who had carried the weight of armies in Braveheart, who had built empires of billions at the box office, now stood in the ruins of an empty home. The house that had once rung with the chaos of 7 children now echoed with a silence so heavy it cut deeper than any critic's words. The family table, once crowded with spilled milk and playful arguments over dinner, now sat half empty, a reminder that the fortress had fallen. Hollywood, which had once envied his perfect family, now watched in hushed fascination as one of its rarest love stories unraveled. For Gibson, the divorce from Robin Moore was not just another chapter. It was the deepest wound of his life, not because of the staggering fortune divided, but because it stripped him of the anchor that had shielded the fragile boy within the child who had once fought hunger, loneliness, and ridicule. In losing Robin, he lost not just a partner, but the fortress that had kept his storms at bay. And so the haunting truth remained. Even titans can fall, and when they do, it is not the spotlight that burns them, but the silence of a home that no longer waits. When the fortress of his first marriage finally crumbled, Mel Gibson was left hollow, stripped of the one sanctuary that had shielded him from the storms of fame. Out of that emptiness, he reached for renewal and thought he had found it in Russian pianist Oksana Grigorieva. For a time, the beginning felt like a balm on open wounds. Music drifted through their home, her piano notes softening the silence, and Gibson for once allowed himself to believe in tenderness again. In 2009, the birth of their daughter Lucia seemed to complete the fragile picture. He held her with the awe of a man who had known hunger and loneliness as a child, whispering to friends that fatherhood once again was his greatest role. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though the storms had finally broken, that the boy who once fought shadows had at last found light. But happiness built on fragile ground can crack the loudest. What began as quiet disagreements soon hardened into open wounds. By 2010, the promise of healing had turned into war. Recordings of their fights, raw and unfiltered, erupted into the public domain, played and replayed until the world could recite them by heart. Courtrooms replaced living rooms. Headlines blared in merciless tones. Flash bulbs outside courthouse doors cut through the night like lightning. Each burst freezing Gibson's pain into images that would outlive the moment. The man who once lifted audiences to their feet with Braveheart was now brought to his knees under the glare of judgment. His private anguish transformed into global entertainment. The settlement that followed in 2011 offered no relief. Money was transferred, custody decided, property divided. But the fracture ran deeper than paper could mend. What was lost was not only a relationship, but dignity, privacy, and the last illusion of invulnerability. If his divorce from Robin had stripped away his fortress, the collapse with Oksana stripped away his mask before the world, leaving only the raw, faltering man beneath. Years later, when asked about those days, Gibson did not reach for excuses. Instead, his words were stripped bare, carrying the weight of confession. I did things I wish I hadn't. You learn. Sometimes the hardest way, it was not redemption, but recognition. An acknowledgement that wounds left in the open may never close, but can teach even giants how fragile they are. When the storms of scandal and divorce had stripped Mel Gibson of nearly everything: his marriage, his fortress of home, even much of his dignity, it seemed as though the curtain had closed for good. Once a man who had commanded armies on screen and filled homes with laughter, he now faced silence so heavy it threatened to crush him. And yet life has a way of surprising even the most battered souls. In 2014, that surprise arrived in the form of Rosalind Ross, a former equestrian champion and screenwriter, 35 years his junior. To the outside world, their union sparked whispers and raised eyebrows, but for Gibson, weathered by decades of chaos, Rosalind was no scandal. She was calm where there had once been fire, a quiet harbor after too many storms, and proof that love can still find those who no longer expect it. In 2017, their son Lars was born, and with him came a resurrection no Oscar could rival. Gibson, who had carried empires and awards on his shoulders, now bent to carry a child in his arms. Not on a battlefield, not beneath blinding lights, but in the small rhythms of fatherhood. Midnight cries, little hands tugging at his shirt, mornings lit not by cameras, but by the laughter of a boy who saw him simply as Dad. By then, Gibson's journey as a father was already layered with joy and heartbreak. With Robin Moore, his first wife, he had raised 7 children over 26 years, a home once alive with quarrels, laughter, and the thunder of small feet racing across hallways. After the divorce, most of those children stayed close to their mother, and some grew distant from a father engulfed in public storms. With Oksana Grigorieva, he had a daughter, Lucia, but her childhood was marked by custody arrangements and the absence of unity. For Gibson, the most haunting memories were not from film sets, but from dining tables where chairs once full of children now sat empty. Reminders of a family scattered. And then came Lars. Not a replacement, but a reminder that life, even after collapse, can offer new beginnings. The contrast was staggering. Once presiding over a household of 7 voices clamoring for space, now cherishing the single laughter of a toddler who could banish silence with one giggle. Watching Lars grow was not about redeeming himself in the eyes of critics, but about rediscovering tenderness, patience, and humility. "You never stop being a father," Gibson once admitted. "No matter what happens, it's the one role you can't walk away from." Today, with 9 children across generations, Gibson lives with both pride and regret. Some ties are strained, others strong, but all remain part of the tapestry of his life. He does not claim perfection. He has never denied his failures, his scars, or the shadows of his past. Yet perhaps that is where the deeper truth lies. That greatness is not born from flawless lives, but from the courage to rise after falling, to keep walking, even when the world has stopped believing in you. For Gibson, the final measure of legacy is not the billions his films earned, nor the statues etched with his name, but the fragile salvation found in the laughter of a child who still believes his father is a hero. The battles that once made Mel Gibson a legend on screen have left their marks not only on cinema's memory, but carved into the very lines of his body. The man who once thundered across the fields of Braveheart, who hurled himself into fire and shattered glass, as Riggs in Lethal Weapon now wakes to a body that reminds him daily that glory always extracts its price. Costumes can hide wrinkles, applause can drown silence, but neither can erase the toll of years. Time has not merely tapped him on the shoulder. It has pressed into his bones, bent his back, and made every step a reminder that even giants must bow to age. For decades, alcohol was both his refuge and his curse. What began as a boy's desperate escape hardened into chains of dependency, dragging him through years when every morning was a fog. That fog nearly consumed him. Yet today, Gibson stands more than 10 years sober, a survivor who faces each dawn as a new choice, a new battle. It's a battle every day, he once admitted, but he has fought it step by step, glass by glass, refused. And in that struggle, he proved that the fiercest wars are not waged on film sets, but within the fragile walls of a man's own will. In 2020, another storm struck, this one beyond his control. At 64, Gibson was hospitalized with COVID-19, a silent enemy that swept through the world like a thief in the night. For days he lay in a hospital bed, a man once armored in roles of warriors and kings, suddenly reduced to the quiet hum of monitors and the uncertainty of breath. He recovered, but the experience left a scar no camera could capture. The knowledge that strength is fleeting, that even the bravest heart beats on fragile ground. Then in 2025 came a revelation that explained a pain he had carried since boyhood. Gibson revealed that he had been born with a crooked spine, a hidden defect that condemned him to a lifetime of chronic back pain. Fans had cheered as he charged into battlefields, lifted swords, wore armor heavier than any ordinary man could bear. Few knew that beneath those scenes, every movement carried a price. Nights of sleepless agony, mornings when he struggled just to stand upright. It was not Hollywood stunt work that wounded him, but life itself. And yet he endured. The crooked spine was more than a condition. It was a metaphor of his existence. Bent, scarred, imperfect, but never broken. And still he refuses surrender. At 69, Gibson shed nearly 30 pounds, not for vanity, but survival. Through strict diet and relentless exercise, he carved his body lean again, fighting against age itself. Today, he cuts a different figure. Silver hair framing a weathered face, beard trimmed tight, eyes no longer blazing with reckless fire, but glowing with a quieter, tempered light. His gait may stiffen his back, may ache, but he carries himself with a discipline sharpened by pain. He is not the wild-eyed warrior of 30, but something rarer. A man who has learned to live with his wounds and walk forward despite them. The lesson of his body is as sharp as any script he has ever delivered. Youth burns bright, but excess leaves scars, and time will always demand its reckoning. And yet scars need not be shame. In recovery and discipline, in quiet perseverance, Gibson has proven that weakness can become strength, that survival itself is a triumph. For audiences who once watched him storm castles and defy bullets, the older Gibson tells a different story. Not of invincibility, but of endurance. Not of flawless glory, but of hard-won resilience. And perhaps this, more than any role he has played, is his most profound performance. Not the hero who never falls, but the man who rises again and again, no matter how heavy the years, no matter how deep the scars. Carrying on for himself, his family, and for the simple truth that to endure is its own kind of greatness. Now at 69, Mel Gibson lives not only with the scars of battles fought in body and soul, but also with the weight of a fortune built through fire, sweat, and storms. His net worth is estimated at nearly $500 million, an astonishing transformation for a boy who once went to bed hungry. And yet wealth has never been a shield from loss. In early 2025, when wildfires swept through the Pacific Palisades, flames consumed more than timber and steel Gibson's Malibu mansion. The oceanfront sanctuary he had purchased in 2008 for $11.5 million and later rebuilt was reduced to ash. Guest houses, a pool house, cars in the garage, family heirlooms, guitars, photographs, all swallowed in a blaze that raged too fast to stop. He and his family escaped unharmed, but afterward he stood on smoldering earth and confessed with quiet agony, "The pain isn't the house. It's the memories you can't get back today. The ruins are being cleared, foundations prepared for rebuilding, yet no reconstruction can bring back the voices, the laughter, the years that vanished in smoke." For a man worth hundreds of millions, the cruel irony was clear. Money can buy another mansion, but never the past. This was not the only jewel in his crown. In 2005, Gibson purchased Mago Island in Fiji, a breathtaking expanse of over 500 to 400 acres, one of the largest privately owned islands in the Pacific. Hidden from the world by turquoise waters and coral reefs, it is a kingdom of untouched beauty. Rolling hills, white sand beaches, coconut groves swaying in the wind. Few eyes have ever seen its shores, for it is not a resort, but a private empire, a place where Gibson could disappear entirely from the noise of fame and be lord only to the sea and the stars. Back in the United States, his holdings spoke of another kind of refuge. In the rugged hills of Texas lies his sprawling ranch, 750 square feet of stone and timber, built like a fortress of solitude. 2 master suites, a wine cellar carved into its heart, ponds that shimmer in the Texas sun, and a horse barn where Gibson trades scripts for saddles. Here the chaos of Hollywood feels distant. The rhythm of hooves and the silence of wide skies offer a man once devoured by storms a different kind of peace. In Malibu, before the fire, his estate was a palace by the sea. 500 square feet of glass and stone perched above the Pacific with guest houses, a pool house, and gardens that tumbled into the horizon. It was a mansion fit for a star who had conquered both box office and Oscars, and yet it too proved mortal when flames consumed it in 2025. But perhaps the most personal of his creations is not measured in square footage, but in devotion. In Agora Hills, California, he built and funded the Holy Family Chapel, a sanctuary that rises not for crowds, but for prayer. With its hand-carved wood, stained glass windows, and quiet reverence, it is a monument not to fame, but to faith. A testament to the belief that steadied him through exile and resurrection. Surrounding these sanctuaries were the indulgences that came with fortune. A garage once filled with contrasts that mirrored his own restless spirit. The comic humility of a smart car, the understated dignity of a Lexus LS 430, the rugged power of a Toyota Land Cruiser, the prestige of a Range Rover Sport, the sleek force of a Mercedes-Benz CLS 500. On his wrist, time was measured not only in hours, but in legacy marked by a gold Rolex Submariner and the iconic Pepsi GMT Master 2. Once he was even linked to the Hawker 400 XP, a private jet that carried him across continents like a warrior with wings. And yet for all this glittering display, Gibson's story was never only about what he owned. For every mansion and island, there was a donation. Tens of millions poured into hospitals, schools, sacred art, endangered lands, and children in need. His wealth built sanctuaries, yes, but it also rebuilt lives. He has poured not just money, but pieces of himself into causes far beyond the walls of his own home. Tens of millions have flowed quietly from his fortune to places where need outweighed hope. To UCLA Mattel and Cedars-Sinai, where children too young to carry pain fought for life with the help of machines and medicine his donations made possible. To the restoration of Renaissance art, ensuring that genius painted centuries ago would not fade into dust. To his alma mater, the National Institute of Dramatic Art in Sydney, where unknown boys and girls stand where he once stood chasing a dream he now sustains for them. In Guatemala, he gave $500,000 to preserve the ancient Mayan ruins of El Mirador Basin, not for fame, but to guard history itself from vanishing. He reached to indigenous communities, supported projects in recycling and sustainability, and funded programs like Angels at Risk, helping young people step back from the cliff's edge of drugs and despair. These gifts were rarely broadcast, rarely spoken of. They were not for the spotlight. They were the quiet proof that even a man walking through storms could choose again and again to lift someone else from the flood. And yet when all the mansions are tallied, when the islands and estates are named, Gibson's true wealth is counted differently now. It lies in the fragile, ordinary rhythms of family. With Rosalind Ross and their son Lars, he divides his time between California and Texas, no longer living as the restless star sprinting from set to set, but as a man who finds meaning in the quiet of mornings, in the laughter of a boy who only calls him Dad. Occasionally, he returns to the spotlight, reuniting with Danny Glover in moments that remind the world of their immortal bond, or shaping new films. Flight Risk with Mark Wahlberg, The Long-Dreamed Resurrection of the Christ, and Lethal Weapon. 5. The fire of creation still burns, but now it burns steady, refined, tempered, no longer wild, but purposeful. Perhaps his greatest legacy will not be the box office billions, the golden statues, or the battle cries of Braveheart. It will be the chapel he built, the children healed by donations. They will never know came from him. The young actors stepping into classrooms paid for by his generosity, the communities preserved because he chose to give. His truest monument is not carved in stone or etched in light, but carried in the quietly touched along the way. Mel Gibson's life, with all its triumphs and failures, whispers a truth sharper than any sword. Greatness is not perfection, and redemption is not applause. They are the choices made in silence to rise after a fall, to endure when the world doubts you, to give, even when storms rage. His scars remain, but they shine as armor proof that even when fire reduces everything to ash, light can still return if you choose to rise. If Braveheart once stirred your courage, if Riggs once made you laugh and ache, if Gibson's long journey of fall and redemption speaks to you, consider leaving a like as a small tribute. Which role touched you most? Do you believe his fight for redemption deserves to be remembered with honor? And what memory of his films still lingers in your heart?